people who listen to this will then say, is this a kind of Orwellian 1984 world where we're heading to with different alliances? That, of course, could and should not be the idea. The other thing then is that maybe this regiopolarity can also be translated in some heteropolarity, which means that you can be a pole on one dimension, which does not necessarily mean that you are a pole in other dimensions. Anyway, what is there to do for Europe in this? I think that given the forces of globalization, given the economic shift in gravity of the economic world, as I called it, we can only continue to deepen European integration, but my belief is that we also need to combine it with a new transatlantic integration. Until now, the transatlantic relations between the EU and the US have been mainly organized around security dimension, NATO, and we don't have a US-EU free trade agreement at this moment. I know some people are thinking to start something, but it is a debate, and it is an increasingly debate also within the European Commission. Two, if the EU wants to live up to its ambitions of being a global actor, it somehow has to make sure that the global playing field, the multilateral system, has to change itself. So I think there is a whole possibility there for the EU to act as a change agent in the multilateral system, which, because of course this cannot be idiosyncratic, could create new conditions for other regional organizations to become more active at that level. And again, I refer to what is mentioned in the Charter of the United Nations. And then finally, inside, we have this debate about what should be the visions about where to go with Europe. One part of that vision tackles the instruments and the formalities, like can we have variable speed and stuff like that. For me, what is even more important and what seems to be lacking a little bit is that there should be an idea, a content-related idea of how these aspirations of global power can be realized. One possibility here is, and this is in a new document of the European Commission, is the idea of a new renaissance, that we put forward the idea that we should mobilize maximally in Europe science and technology for combating global problems. And this is again something where then an alliance with the United Nations can be established. Last slide, Mr. Chair. So coming back to my initial thing, is the EU sui generis? Well, yes, in a way that it has aspects like all other regional trade agreements, but mind you, not necessarily free trade agreements. This is all the issue about removing economic barriers. A bit because we can compare it with some federal entities, and I agree with André that at the end of the day, it is more, in terms of federalism, really very almost unique structure. And it is like no other form of governance, because it's a regional organization with global aspirations for the region. It can, of course, not be a model to be copied, but I do know that some scholars and some policymakers outside of Europe look to Europe and say, let us learn as much as possible what we can learn from this European expertise and experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Langenhoff, for this admirable presentation, especially ending up on time as well. And our last speaker, certainly not least, is Professor Aaron Winters. He is the Chief Economist of the Department for International Development, DFID, of the UK. He's also Professor of Economics at Sussex University, and he is a lot of other things. But the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and my thanks to GDN for inviting me, and to you for coming to listen after lunch. I guess that my message is rather similar to Luke's and to Andre's, but I do hope to end up with some sort of concrete advice with which you could take issue at the end of in the conversation. I'm going to divide my comments into 4 parts, basically. I want to talk about the origins and institutions of European integration. And not that I consider myself an expert on these things, but it just seems that it's really central to the story. I'm going to talk about the balance of power in a rather specific sort of way. Then trade and production, which is something I've spent some time thinking about, and then European policy in a couple of particular senses. Also an area that I have in the past worked. The important thing about European integration, it seems to me, is that it has a long history. It has a grand vision. In fact, one can go back even to sort of 15th and 14th centuries and find people talking about, wishing about integrating Europe in some way, and Napoleon had a very good shot at it. And so it's not something that is restricted to the last 50 years. Over the 19th century, Europe was subject to sort of 2 sets of conflicting forces. There was a good deal of natural integration going on. Transportation costs were coming down, and so it became much easier to think in terms of integrating Europe. But one also had the growth of, continuing growth, I guess I should say, of nationalism as a force. And these 2 forces continue to sort of rival each other through into the interwar period in the 20th century. One of the really major consequences of those 2 forces interacting was that the French and the Germans had vicious wars 3 times over. And twice those wars engulfed the rest of the world in consequences that are still so awful it's hard to contemplate them. And that, it seems to me, is a really fundamental dimension of where European integration in its post-war dimensions came from. At the end of the third of those conflicts, having twice failed to find a workable solution previously, a phoenix arose from the ashes in terms of the internationalism that characterized the post-war vision. The United Nations, the American view of internationalism, the Bretton Woods institutions. And Europe essentially held its head in its hand and said, we have to find a way. Internationalism looked as if it was the sort of route to go. The consequence of that is that we need to see European integration as a sort of political, ideological movement. It was a political and ideological movement and an idea that happened to have some economic consequences. But with 100% certainty, it didn't arise because a bunch of economists sat down with their slide rules and did a cost-benefit analysis. I mean, no one cared about trade creation and trade diversion. So it has this grand driving force. And suddenly, when you think about surrendering sovereignty, which, as Andre and Luc have both mentioned, is part of the process, if you have this immense force behind you, it suddenly becomes much easier to start shipping off bits of sovereignty and sharing it, rather than having the bloody economists ticking away, saying, oh, no, it's going to cost you 100 million. So it's very, very important, I think, when we think of whether Europe has got lessons for other people, is to remember it's come from a very, very particular history. Now, the stages of creating the European Union, it's been called several things in its life. I'm going to refer to it always as the European Union. Benelux, customs union, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, created in 1944 and sort of operative by 1948, 47 perhaps. Then, in a sense, the giant leap, the European Coal and Steel Community, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, as Luc said, created to make war not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. Extremely rigorous regime of controlling iron and steel output, inputs, prices, the lot. Everything was pretty much controlled. That was 1951. Over the 50s, there was talk of a European defense community, a European political community. They came to nothing. And then someone, it was part of the same sort of process that someone had to formulate it, said, how about an economic community?